We're really fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Kevin Stinson from St. Mary's General Hospital in Kitchener. Kevin's he's got an alphabet soup of credentials behind his name, but I think for today's purposes, it's important to know undergrad was in microbiology, has a PhD in infectious diseases, immunology, and currently he is the infection control practitioner at St. Mary's General. And as you might expect, having a job called infection control practitioner has made him a busy individual in the last 9 months. We thought it was important today to reach out to Kevin and begin this conversation, or to have this conversation rather, in part because OGRA took an unusual stance of asking for those who are going to be engaged in winter maintenance be given some extra consideration or priority when vaccines are deployed. And it's not something we typically would do, but we thought our analysis of the COVID impact more broadly and specifically with relation to the municipal sector has been that this has been oftentimes a weak link problem. And it seemed that for every Kevin who's out there on the front lines managing this crisis for us, there was also an assumption that if it snowed hard enough, we could complicate his ability to do that. So that was the rationale behind making that decision. And I think that for the most part, it's been well received, interestingly received. I think there's been some acknowledgement on the part of our members that there's some logic and rationale to doing this. And so we thought if we've asked or we've implied that folks doing frontline work on behalf of municipalities should be given this consideration, they should also be given the opportunity to hear from one of the leading thinkers that we know of who can actually touch on and answer these questions. And that's why Kevin's here today. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over. Kevin's already loaded his presentation up onto the screen here. I'm going to let him run through those slides and also remind everyone that there is the opportunity to pose questions here. A number of questions have already been submitted. If you have questions during the presentation, simply go in the Q&A module at the bottom and post them. And I will do my best to get through as many of these as we possibly can during the interim. And we will get through those and hopefully send everyone on the way feeling reassured about what's beginning to feel like a vaguely optimistic outcome of 2020. It's certainly not the pessimism that greeted us way back in the spring of this year. So, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that great introduction, and thanks very much for having me. I want to start off with saying that this is a fairly informal presentation itself. Really, the crux of what we're going to be getting to is the Q&A component. I can't claim to have all the answers, but I can claim to try. I'm going to do my best to kind of distill the science and the background in the some of the concepts of both COVID in general and vaccines and whatever you guys want to know about of the topic and see if I can help explain where we are, why we are, how we are. So I've given this presentation a few times already this week. This is the first non-healthcare group. So the first few slides are a little bit more, a little bit healthcare heavy. So we'll skip through those fairly quickly, and we'll just kind of do some key points rather than diving deep into the in-depth immunology discussions. So to start off, as we're talking about general concepts of COVID-19 vaccines, I think it's important to recognize or important to kind of go over what do we actually look at when someone has an infection? What happens in the body? And what does that do when we compare that to a vaccine? So when we get infected with a virus, we actually have two kinds of immune responses that are really taking hold. And you can see that on the slide here. The image on the right under the column immune response to infection, that's the kind of those twofold ways that the body is going to respond to a virus. So the first thing that we have is what we call the cell-mediated immune response. And this is characterized by something called cytotoxic T cells. It's an immune cell that's job is to seek out and find infected cells and kill them very quickly. And the whole idea behind this is when a cell gets infected with a virus, it can identify that there's foreign proteins inside of it. And it can process those proteins and display it on a molecule on the cell surface as a little bit of a help me flag. And when a cell's doing that, a T cell can come around and recognize, bind to that, and kill the cell. And this happens all the time in the body. It's happening, every minute of every day. This kind of T cell cleanup of infected or potentially damaged cells. And it's a good thing. It's what our body's naturally going to do. The other thing that we have is what we call the humoral immune response. And this is what we think of as more the protection from infection. And this is those antibodies. So as we start to see these viruses in the body, our white cells can start recognizing them as foreign and start identifying them, processing them, and creating antibodies. And those antibodies can do a lot of good things, namely a neutralizing antibody can bind to a virus to stop it from then entering a cell. Hence the name neutralizing, because it neutralizes that virus. So these are really kind of key topics to look at here. And the biggest problem with vaccine technology right now is it's very, very heavily focused on the humoral arm, that antibody arm, and not so much on the T cell arm. So if we look at something like our influenza vaccine, you take a dead virus and you inject it into you. And that dead virus isn't going to enter any cells. So because it's not entering any cells, it's not starting that cascade that leads to cells signaling the help me molecule. And without that help me molecule, those T cells don't get activated to learn how to better fight and identify infected cells in the future. It's really good though at creating those antibodies. What we found with COVID and with other coronaviruses, but COVID because it's the one that's front and center right now, is antibodies are great, but they're not very long lasting. They only last about 2 years. And with COVID in particular, a big, big thing is that T cell immunity, that ability for the body to recognize an infected cell very, very quickly and kill it. Because what happens with our cells is when we get a COVID infection, the idea is that it starts that process and it signals the help me molecule. But if it doesn't happen, or if it doesn't get cleaned up and taken out by T cells fast enough, it says, all right, I've called for help and no help is coming. I'm going to do what we call pyroptosis. And it's essentially the cell's going to say, I'm going to kill myself. I know I'm infected. I'm going to kill myself. And by killing myself, I'm going to release this massive inflammatory cascade and this massive inflammatory signal. And hopefully by doing that, all of these other immune cells are going to come rushing into the site and hopefully take care of this infection that clearly I can't fix myself. So that's what the cell does. It signals help me, and if no help comes, it kills itself. Now, that's fine when it's one cell, but when you have large chunks of your lungs doing that, that's where you get pneumonia. Because you have all of these areas of the lungs where these immune cells are rushing in and invading into the lungs. And that's what actually causes a viral pneumonia. So the ability for the body to recognize infected cells early and quickly and kill them is really, really important, not so much to prevent infection, that's the work of antibodies, but to prevent severe disease. So that's really what they're looking for when they're thinking of how do we create better vaccines. So the idea is, with the column on the very right there, is we want a vaccine that does two things. We want it to do those antibodies to provide that protection, but we also want those T cell responses so that if we do get an infection, our body is much more primed and ready to identify something when it's or a cell when it's infected and take it out fast. So that kind of gets into the general idea of how did we get to this idea of a new type of vaccines. And we really say new vaccines because these mRNA vaccines that are coming out for COVID are the first ones on the market to be to actually be fully marketed. They're not actually the first ones to be developed or tested, or even really new technology to be conceived of. It's been work that they've been working on for over 3 decades. It's just that this is now the pointy end of the stick of it finally getting out into market. So the idea with this is, instead of taking a virus, instead of taking a dead virus or even a weakened virus, they take something called the mRNA. So mRNA is a messenger RNA. It's the intermediate between your DNA, your genome, and the protein at the other end. And by taking that intermediate and coating it in lipids, coating it in fat, so it's a little nanoparticle that looks just like a cell, but all it contains is that mRNA. That lipid nanoparticle can fuse with cells and release the mRNA into it. So this is the pathway on the screen here of A. So once that mRNA is in the cell, it starts getting converted into proteins. So this would be the same process that would happen if you have that natural viral infection. But now, instead of it actually being a virus, you're just taking the mRNA just for the one protein you want to stimulate an immune response to. And for COVID, that's the spike protein of COVID. So once you have this protein in, it starts getting created, the body starts recognizing as, hey, that's not my proteins, that's a foreign protein. And it takes it, it digests it, and you can see at the very bottom of the screen here, something called MHC1. That's that help me signal. That's that molecule where it's going to say, all right, this is foreign. We're going to take a chunk of it, we're going to process it, and we're going to display it for a help me signal to start getting those T cell responses primed and ready. Because what ends up happening next is, once the T cells start recognizing it, they can then start replicating themselves and making more copies of themselves. They kind of say, all right, we've seen that there's this infection with this peptide or this molecule. Let's start making more copies of T cells that are going to recognize cells that have that infection. So this is a process called clonal expansion. You're expanding a clone of your T cells. The other thing that happens is, once you have this protein being made, as cells are getting taken out by T cells, as that process of those cytotoxic T cells taking out infected cells happens, the protein gets released out. And then some of those proteins get swallowed up by immune cells like they normally would if it was a full virus. And that's that process B that you see on the screen here. And this is the process that activates antibodies. So these vaccines kind of give us that both arms. It gives us that T cell arm, and it gives us that antibody arm. So the antibodies are going to be what prevents infection. The T cells is going to be, if you do get an infection, how do we make sure that it stays a mild infection and doesn't go as severe disease, doesn't turn into a pneumonia? So that's the gist of it. The real nice thing about these is they don't replicate. This isn't a virus. It's not, it's not something that the mRNA is going to continue replicating itself and then leave and then infect another cell and leave and infect another cell. There's no actual virus here. It's very much a self-limiting injection. Once it's injected, it starts to destabilize really, really quickly. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides here. So that's the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. Pfizer, of course, is approved right now in Canada. It's been injected, I think the first day was Monday, if I look at my screen here. Monday or Tuesday was the first shot into an arm. It's, of course, been used and active right now in the UK. Moderna is not active anywhere yet. They are in the application process for approvals, and the evidence for their vaccine is being reviewed. But the third front runner company is this group called AstraZeneca. It was the University of Oxford vaccine. So this one is active right now in the UK as well. It's approved and being used in the UK. And it takes a little bit of a different approach to solve the same problem. So instead of it being those nanoparticles of this just lipids coating mRNA or fats coating mRNA that just go and fuse into cells, the AstraZeneca vaccine is what we call a replication deficient, so it cannot replicate, adenovirus vector. So what they do is they take that same gene, the spike protein from COVID, and instead of coating it in fats, they coat it in the shell of an adenovirus. Adenoviruses are very, very common viruses. We run into them daily. They can cause common colds, they can cause diarrhea, they can cause a ton of different diseases, most of which we're already largely immune to. So what they do with this is they use the shell of that because it gives the ability to enter into a cell, but they strip out all of the genes that are going to let it replicate. And when they strip out all those genes, they replace it with the gene that they want to express. So in this case, the spike protein from COVID. And we call that the transgene, something that you want to express once it's in the cell. And this whole process is really driven off the back end of gene therapy. So things like if we look at cystic fibrosis is caused by a deletion of a gene called CFTR. It's a really important gene for chloride ion secretions within the GI tract and within the respiratory tract that allows you to essentially secrete moisture and water. So when you have that deletion, that's how you get cystic fibrosis. In gene therapy vectors, they use this exact same technology, except instead of using it to deliver a viral gene, they use it to deliver that CFTR gene. So it's replacing a missing gene. So they kind of took that same technology, and instead of saying, let's put a human gene in, they said, all right, well, let's try putting in this gene for the spike protein from COVID. And once it's inside the body, it starts to get expressed the same way that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines were doing. And it activates all of those same pathways and cascades to say, all right, this is now a foreign protein. Let's signal that help me molecule. Let's activate those T cell responses. And then once the protein is released, the protein can get swallowed up and can activate all those antibody responses. So that's the real kind of in-depth background of how do we actually get an immune response to a virus, and how are these vaccines differing from some of our base vaccines, or the common vaccines we would typically see, which is just, I'm going to take a virus, I'm going to kill it, I'm going to shoot that into your arm. So, of course, that ends up causing a lot of questions because it's new, because it's the first time that these are coming into the market. So, the first question I get a lot, or myth I hear a lot, is because these are new, they were rushed market, we bypassed safety measures, and we're not actually sure whether this is a safe vaccine or not. And the fact of the matter is like we kind of said already, the mRNA vaccines, as an example, have been worked on for decades. The first conceptualization of an mRNA vaccine was about 30 years ago. And the big thing about vaccine science is it's not the actual, clinical trial process that takes time. It's the decades of that base research leading up to the clinical trials that takes time. So all three of these front-running companies actually had a vaccine in development for MERS-CoV. It's a very, very similar virus causing a disease called the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. It's like SARS. It's really circulating in the Middle East. It's significantly more fatal. It's about a 35% across the board fatality rate, but it's a lot less infectious. So that's why we haven't had a massive pandemic from it. That's a very common thing. Typically, the more fatal a virus is, right? You look at Ebola, actually the harder it is for it to become a pandemic potential bug, because it's a lot of the time, instead of sitting there going, I really don't feel good, I'm sleeping tonight, or I'm staying in bed today rather, and I'm not going anywhere. It's, you get COVID where it's, I got a little scratch in my throat, but I really need groceries, so I'm going off to the grocery store right now, right? So it's that kind of milder virus is actually easier to transmit because of that. But I'm digressing. So all three of these companies had this MERS-CoV vaccine in development. They were all in phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. And then COVID came around. They said, all right, well, we have this drug that we're working on that's been working well. Let's swap out the proteins. We'll take out the MERS protein. We'll put in the COVID protein, restart our animal trials. All right, animal trials are good. Let's get it into phase 1 clinicals, and then phase 2, and then phase 3 clinicals. And that's what we found, is that all 3 of these drugs did go through a full 3-phase clinical efficacy and safety trial. And this is the typical safety trials that any other vaccine or any other drug coming to market goes through in order to make sure that, 1, it works, because you don't really want a drug that doesn't do anything, and 2, that it's safe. And of course, you know, the other thing is that, like a lot of research efforts right now, there's typically a very long administrative approval line. And the time it takes to get administrative approval isn't actually the time it takes for that data to be reviewed by someone and for them to make a decision. It's the waiting list to get that piece of paper in front of the right person, right? That's the thing that takes the longest right now, right? Getting a passport, for example, really only takes overnight. You can pay a lot of money to get your passport done overnight or in 72 hours. But if you don't pay a lot of money, it takes 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 8 weeks, right? It's the same kind of concept here. There's that long lineup that ends up that you have to wait in. At the start of COVID, what they said is, all right, anything that is COVID related research-wise is skipping the line. Everything else is on hold. We are not processing any other applications right now. We are solely looking at COVID. So if it says COVID across the title, it's skipping that 18-month waiting line, or 18-month wait list to get reviewed. It also kind of helps when you have a drug company that says, all right, listen, everything else stops. This is your priority. This is all you're focusing on. Don't worry about budget, carte blanche, make it happen. Science moves very quickly when you take out all of the financial restrictions and you dump every single ounce of your efforts and energy into one topic. So, Scott, do we want to do some questions now, or to keep going through these and do them later?
Well, how many more do you have to go through? I think that'll...
We got a few, I think I have three other kind of myth fact pages. So why don't we go through those, because it might answer some of the questions. Yeah. All right. So, the next big thing I hear is, will an mRNA vaccine alter your DNA? And Scott, this is probably one of the posts that I think you got sent to you, right? Because we hear this a lot, and I think the concept behind that is there's a confusion between an mRNA, which is a natural protein. You have mRNA in your cells right now, right? It's how your body goes from DNA to protein. It's that intermediate step. So in order for mRNA to alter your DNA, it has to get reverted back into DNA. And then that DNA can get inserted into your genome. And we call that, we see that a lot with retroviruses like HIV. But it has to go through a process called reverse transcriptase. So transcribing is how you make mRNA. You transcribe DNA into mRNA. Reverse transcribing is where you take that mRNA and convert it back into DNA. We don't naturally have reverse transcriptases in our cells. So when you take something like HIV, a retrovirus, it actually comes with a gene that the first thing that it does when it enters the cell, or one of the first things, is it creates those reverse transcriptases so that they can go and create copies of DNA from your RNA and then integrate it into your DNA. And that's how you get that integration. So we don't actually have that. So without it being packaged in these vaccines or given the ability to encode in these vaccines, which of course it isn't, there's no ability for it to convert back into anything. And even if it were to convert back into DNA, there isn't any genes to then integrate it into your genome. So really it doesn't have anything, any way of changing your DNA. The other thing about mRNA, it's really unstable. It is a highly unstable molecule, and it's that for a reason. If we think of our own cells, if I'm a cell and I want to create a copy of a protein, and I have my DNA here, if I make that mRNA intermediate, and that's a permanent molecule, my cell is just always going to keep making that protein. So this is a way that it tries to regulate how much protein am I making. So mRNA is an unstable molecule. So once it's in the cell, it really starts to break down quite quickly, both by just natural decay. And inside of our cell, we have proteins that are actually designed to break down mRNA to do that exact same idea of that's how we regulate gene expression. That's how we regulate protein production in our body. So the double-stranded DNA vaccine, like we said, is based off of, or so the AstraZeneca vaccine, that's based off of a gene therapy vector. So by and large, the idea is it could persist in the cells if it was a human gene. But the fact of the matter is we're not putting a human gene in, we're putting a foreign gene in, and our body is really good at recognizing when there's a foreign gene that comes in or a foreign protein in our body. So as soon as it starts getting replicated and expressed, or not replicated, sorry, but expressed inside of a cell, our body recognizes, or our cells recognize that it's foreign and activate all those pathways to call in T cells to kill the cell. So even though that AstraZeneca vaccine, which has the technology to allow that persistence, our immune response doesn't let that happen. So then, of course, we come to the question of, are they safe? Do they cause reactions? Which the post-injection and medication reaction, these occur fairly rarely from all medication. There's no real greater risk from any individual vaccine. There's no greater risk from this vaccine. We hear stories of the UK had 2 severe allergic reaction cases within the first week of administration. Unfortunately, that happens with a lot of different medications. That happens with over-the-counter medications very frequently. And that's the case that some people with severe allergies or some people with no allergies are allergic to something they've just never come across before. And that's the reason if you go to your Shoppers Drug Mart and get a flu shot, they usually make you wait around for 15 minutes afterwards. And that's just in case you start having a severe allergic reaction, that you're having it in the Shoppers Drug Mart where they have an EpiPen on standby, ready to jab you in the arm in case you start having an anaphylactic reaction. So what they found was that the risk of severe disease or severe reactions is no greater with this vaccine than anything else. Most people are reporting pain in the injection site in the arm, maybe some body aches and fevers for a day or two. And those are the most common side effects. There's that very low percentage of people that will have more severe side effects. But the risk of that isn't much greater than anything else. So the vaccine cannot cause or transmit COVID. There is no actual virus in the vaccine. And the neat thing about it is, if you recall back to that, how does COVID cause severe disease? The idea was, if I'm infected and I send out that little help me signal and no one comes to help me, I'm going to kill myself and release a massive inflammatory response. The way that mRNA is built, because mRNA isn't being actively replicated like the virus is, it actually doesn't activate the suicide pathway of the cell. So it doesn't activate those intracellular receptors, the receptors that look for a viral infection. It just creates the protein, and the protein activates just that help me signal. So it kind of blockades which pathways are being utilized just from the fact that you don't have a replicating virus to cause the pathway that will lead down the rabbit hole to severe disease and pneumonia. So the last big question I get isn't really a myth, it's more of a question, is if the mRNA vaccine needs to be stored at -80, what does that mean? And this comes from everything from logistics perspectives to, does it get injected into my arm at -80, which it does not. So like we said, mRNA is extremely unstable. It likes to break down. So to keep it from deteriorating, we have to keep it frozen. -80 is better. The colder it is, the better. Pfizer has to be stored at -80. Moderna has to be stored at -20. I believe the way they got around this, the way mRNA breaks down is you have it breaks down from the ends in. So if you have your coding section here, if you pad it with what we call a non-coding region, basically just junk. So RNA is that nucleic acid code. So, you know, A's and T's and C's and G's, you just pad it with A for 50 or 100 replicants at either end. As it starts breaking down, it's just chopping off sections that aren't actually encoding any protein, and it doesn't actually impact the stability of the gene that you want to express. So once reconstituted, Pfizer is stable at 4 Celsius for 5 days. So the UK right now, their model of distribution is they have central pharmacies that will reconstitute a drug and then ship it, and reconstitute a batch and ship it. And that way it takes a day to ship to whatever, a long-term care facility, a hospital, what have you. And then there's 4 days to actually get it into arms. Moderna hasn't given their official stability at 4 degrees. At least I haven't been able to find it, but I imagine it's going to be something very similar. Right now, Ontario's model is hub hospitals or hub sites. Whoever is getting the vaccine, they're not shipping it anywhere. They're keeping it local, just in case they reconstitute, and then for whatever reason, there's a shipping error and it can't get out to where it's supposed to, or where they're shipping it to. The roads are crappy and you can't get anywhere because so I imagine that has potential that might change, but right now it seems like that's how they're approaching that problem. The AstraZeneca vaccine doesn't require anything special. It's stored in a fridge just like all other vaccines, and it just has the same old storage requirements. So with that, that's about the kind of key things that I kind of prepare, and now I just kind of I'd love to open it up to what do you guys have questions on? What can I answer that you have?
So yeah, I would read Dr. Stinson's call here. If you have questions, post them in the Q&A. A number have been posted there already. I have pulled them over and will be posing them. One of the risks involved, of course, when we extend an invitation to someone like this is that they do such a comprehensive job that a lot of the questions that we come in with are answered during the course of the process. And I think that may have been the case to a certain extent here. Nonetheless, we still have about 15 questions, I think, so far that I wanted to put. The first one is actually for me, and it was, did we get a response to the work that we undertook and the call that we made from the province? And that hasn't happened yet. I haven't also spoken with my public policy people today, but so far as I know, we haven't received anything yet.
And I'd like to go on record that I'm not involved with any policy decisions, so
leave that
not at that level.
Leave it to the government relations people to manage.
Yeah.
So one of the things, and I don't think it's alarmist, but certainly some of your colleagues in the immunology world have identified the fact that this hasn't had the longitudinal analysis in terms of effects. Can you talk to us a bit about that and explain perhaps why some people see this as a concern and what you as a professional in the space think about that concern?
Yeah, so I know a few of the articles that I'm thinking that if you're from Guelph, you might be referring to the Guelph Today article that Byron Bridle was posted. And I actually know Byron quite well. I'm on a few grants with him, so I gotta chat with him a little about that. So the concern, I guess, is more of a, if you don't know, could there be something theoretical to happen? And I guess that there's always that theory. There's always that possibility. But what we do know right now, so like I said, these aren't necessarily new vaccines. It's new to market, but the technology's been in the works for a while. So as long as 10 years ago, we've had the original phase 1 clinical trials going on. So the idea with those is they're always going to, you always do continuous follow-ups of someone who's in a clinical trial. So if anyone ever develops something funky 10 years down the road, or multiple people in your cohort start developing something funky, you can start to say, all right, maybe there's some long-term impacts here. And nothing's happened yet out of those, in the past 10 years from any of those long-term trials. One of the arguments I heard is, could it potentially cause an autoimmune disorder? And the idea with it potentially causing an autoimmune disorder is this concept that if it's infecting muscle cells, because you're injecting into the arm and it doesn't really infect, but it enters a muscle cell, and the muscle cell is what's signaling for help, could that potentially train T cells to then recognize muscle cells as foreign, and then have those start targeting your muscle cells? And I'd say that's a pretty academic argument. It's I like to call it the burden of knowledge. It's the reason that physicians make terrible patients is they start diagnosing themselves. And I'm not a physician, but I also start to diagnose myself with problems, right? You're looking at is there an academic possibility of something happening? But when we look at reality of an infection, we actually do get viral infection of muscle cells all the time. And by all the time, I mean COVID and influenza and other respiratory viruses don't naturally infect those cells, but in a fairly significant number of people, they can infect those cells, especially in very severe disease. So you get things like rhabdomyolysis, where the muscle is being broken down from a severe infection of influenza in the muscle cells, because the virus is just killing off your muscle cells left, right, and center, and spreading to more muscle cells and killing more, and spreads to more muscle cells and kills more. And that doesn't end up causing an autoimmune disorder. So for it to happen from this vaccine, when we have the natural process already occurring and doesn't seem to cause anything, it's a extremely minor risk. A big chunk of it is also, so it's a concept called epitope spreading. So epitope is what an antibody or a T cell recognizes. It's a specific portion of a protein. And the idea is, if you have something, or if you're recognizing a protein that's bound to your own proteins, and as it gets digested, the epitope that gets recognized is 50% the foreign and 50% your own protein, that might start having your T cells now recognize your protein instead of the foreign protein. But that binding doesn't happen with the intracellularly with the protein. So a really minor risk. Like I said, I think it's the burden of knowledge more than anything.
Okay. I'm wondering if we could get you to stop sharing your screen, maybe, and
Sure.
that way we can pop up here.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Question here about whether or not people who've had COVID-19 and recovered should receive the vaccine.
So should receive it eventually? Probably yes. My understanding, and this is, so Ontario hasn't officially said anything. They're keeping their lips pretty tightly sealed on their actual plan. My understanding is they will likely ask people who've had a previous infection to not receive the vaccine in the initial wave. That's not from a concern of severe side effects. It's more from you're probably have some degree of immunity, but or so because of that, if we have limited vaccine, let's try to get more people vaccinated. The big thing with natural infection, especially in healthier adults who've had very minor disease, is people with severe disease, people who are hospitalized in ICU, intubated, they actually seem to be getting very good reactions. Nice, healthy adults with minor disease, very often, about 20% of cases don't get good protection. And I like to think of it, I was kind of coming up with an analogy on this the other day. The analogy that I came up with is you're at a buffet, and the buffet, you really want steak. And there's not much steak out at the buffet. So you have a little bit of the steak, but you have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, just to try to fill yourself up. But you really wanted a steak, and so you're not really satisfied. Well, the steak is the antigen that's actually going to cause protection. But when you are eating, when your body is seeing a whole virus, there's a whole bunch of other antigens that it tries to process and tries to create antibodies against. But not all of them are going to provide protection. So when you have really mild disease and you don't have a ton of virus to begin with, it's very possible that you don't get a strong response to that one antigen that's actually going to cause protection. So that's that kind of steak. You want the steak, but you can't really get it, so you fill yourself up on other things. These vaccines, because they're targeted, they're giving just that one antigen that we know is going to be causing some protection. So it's the difference of going to that buffet and going to the keg for that nice steak dinner, right? Everything's being served up perfect to cause that protection and that develop those protective neutralizing antibodies.
We have a question. Good feedback. A couple questions here regarding sterilizing immunity versus disease immunity, and which kind of immunity do the vaccines on the market provide?
So by sterilizing immunity, I'm assuming they mean neutralizing immunity. So that's the protection from infection. And by disease immunity, I'm assuming it's protection from severity of disease. So they actually, and please, by all means, fire up a comment if I'm misunderstanding your question. They actually do both. So the antibody side of the house does the protection, does the neutralization, the sterilizing immunity, I guess. That's what prevents a virus from entering a cell and causing and infecting that cell. The T cell responses are the severity of disease protection. So that's the antibodies didn't work, or aren't there, or weren't effective, and the virus still got into the cell. The T cell responses, remember, that's that help me signal, and the T cells can come and kill the cell before the cell goes with the better kill myself and call in friends approach. That's the protection from severity of disease. Because if our body can recognize infected cells early and can kill infected cells early, the virus doesn't have as much of a chance to replicate. And by avoiding that suicide pathway, it stops the massive inflammation at the site of infection, which causes pneumonia. Now, normal vaccines, because they don't, and by the way I say normal, I mean traditional inactivated vaccines like influenza, because they don't enter the cell, they only do the antibody route.
Couple questions here about, I guess, demographic considerations. Has there been analysis done on women's fertility or on women who are pregnant?
So for fertility, there's been nothing published saying that there's a risk, nor can I conceive of anything just in the pathways that are being activated that there's a risk, or at least any greater risk than a natural infection. And what we found from COVID is that COVID infection has minimal impact to risk of fertility, minimal impact to a pregnant person during their first and second trimester. Third trimester, there's no impact to the fetus. There's potential impact to the mother in that it might worsen or increase your risk of severe disease. With that in mind, the vaccine has not been fully tested in pregnant women, and that's not a we're worried that it might. Well, it's kind of a we're worried we don't do anything. Most drugs don't get tested in pregnancy. So most drugs actually have, so drugs in Canada have, or in, well, everywhere, US as well, we refer to something called the Compendium of Pharmaceuticals and Specialties. And the idea is that gives you everything you want to know about a drug, interactions, contraindications, indications, adverse effects, absolutely everything. And one thing on there is pregnancy category. And the vast majority of drugs are pregnancy category X, which means we haven't tested it. So it's up to your physician to figure out whether they want to administer it or not. And the reason that it's a we haven't tested it is ethically it becomes challenging to test something. So what's most likely, or what the NACI, so the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations for Canada, their recommendation for the COVID vaccines is that it's not routinely recommended for women who are pregnant or who are breastfeeding. And it may be considered under exceptional circumstances if the risk of you becoming naturally infected is far greater than, the actualized risk of that is far greater than the potential risk of you getting the vaccine. So if you're in a population, or you're a demographic where, because of other comorbidities, you are very likely going to die if you get COVID, and you're in a very endemic community, your physician might say, all right, well, because of the overall risk factors, it's safer for you to try to get the vaccine. But there's that's the blanket approach is because there's insufficient evidence right now, we're not routinely recommending it for pregnancy or breastfeeding. In terms of someone trying to get pregnant, NACI never put out official recommendations. The British recommendations are, I think they say, wait 2 months after your second dose before trying to conceive. I don't think there's any reasoning behind that. I think they just kind of picked a date.
Do you elaborate on the need for 2 doses?
Yeah, so what they were finding, and actually Pfizer found this as well as AstraZeneca found this, is the first dose gave anywhere from AstraZeneca was 60%, Pfizer was, I think, closer to 80% protection from infection. Excuse me, so those antibody responses, a second dose just improved those antibody responses. And thinking through, trying to theorize why, it's most likely due to the fact that you're in essence, I don't want to use the term wasting, but spending some of that your antigenic budget. If I'm injecting you with X amount of antigen, so what's going to stimulate your immune response, you're spending a lot of it trying to build those T cell responses, that protection from severe disease. And only a small portion of it is going to go and stimulate those antibody responses. So because you're spending so much on those T cell responses, you're just not getting as strong of a protection effect. So what they found was that giving that second dose just helps to build up more of those antibody responses. So when you look at Pfizer, for example, it went from 60% on 1 dose to 90% on 2 doses. But the really interesting component is that even after 1 dose, it was still 100% effective in preventing severe disease of those who did get sick. So it still gets those T cell responses to prevent severity of disease.
Well, that's optimistic. The average person goes and gets they go and get their jab of the needle. What's the typical side effect that you can expect to see, and how does that compare to other vaccines that people may be more familiar with?
So the biggest one that you'll find is going to be the pain in the arm, right? So then that's the typical local immune response from any vaccine. People are reporting so some body aches, maybe a day or so of fever, fatigue, some of the kind of generalized just achy feeling. You know that feeling about 24 hours before you really get a cold? that kind of a feeling, and that's just the systemic response. I would say it's more likely going to be worse after the second dose than the first, because your body's already primed to receive some responses. So the first dose is going to be very similar to an influenza dose. The second one will be a little worse. There's a few other vaccines that are multi-dose. Rabies is one that springs to mind. Well, actually, before we touch on that one, like MMR is a multi-dose vaccine now. I only just recently had my second dose because I never had 2 doses as a kid because they didn't require it back when I was a kid. But to work in healthcare, you had to get a second booster. Tetanus, we get repeat boosters all the time, or every 10 years, or you should be getting a repeat booster every 10 years. If you haven't gotten your booster for tetanus in 10 years, go get your booster for tetanus, please. Right, and those cause about the same, right? It's that localized infection. I will say rabies is a terrible vaccine. At least when I got it, it was a live vaccine, and live vaccines tend to cause far, far greater reactions. It's known to be one of the, other than shingles, I think it's known to be one of the worst vaccines to get. The first dose was fine, hurt the arm a little bit. The second dose I felt awful for about 24 hours. I think I hallucinated a little bit. Not saying that the COVID vaccine is going to be that bad, because rabies is a live vaccine, very different technology. But the concept will be the same, right? So you'll probably have a little bit more body aches after the second dose.
Okay. One of the concerns that's been raised, I think, in a number of different avenues is the ability of the virus to mutate. And we've seen this in other viruses that spread through either, livestock populations or some of the instances of mink farms, for instance. How does that evolution and mutation interface with the vaccines that are in development?
Yeah, so I'll start off with kind of comparing it to influenza, because influenza is the absolute king of mutations. You blink and influenza's changed 10 times. COVID or coronaviruses are a little bit more of a stable virus, and the reason they're a little bit more stable is they have what influenza lacks, which is a proofreading ability. So when it's making copies of its genome, if it's going along and making a copy of its genome, and it puts the wrong nucleotide in, the wrong letter, then it puts an A instead of a T, it can sit there and go, I put the wrong thing in, goes back, removes it, puts the right one in, and carries on. Influenza can't do that. So influenza is far more prone to this just random day over day changes. So we have a little bit more stability with COVID, but like you said, you look at mink farms, and that's been a huge spot where we've seen some change. And it's not uncommon, because what happens is if you get that jump into a new population, we have something called codon utilization, codon prioritization. Either way, the way that each individual species reads and uses and builds proteins changes very, very slightly. So some viruses, like influenza, like COVID, hops into a mink, and in order to survive in minks, has to have a little bit of a change in that protein so that it's now able to effectively replicate. When it hops back into humans, one of two things can happen. What has happened with so far with the mink stuff is it hopped back into humans. It was minimally / non-infectious in humans, but it was slightly different. It had slightly different antibody binding. So it's minimally infectious in humans because it's gone through that change in the mink that makes it much more infectious in mink, but by doing so, it makes it less infectious in humans, which is good. The fact that it did reduce antibody binding is a concern, but what we should expect to see is those T cell responses are a little bit broader, because they're not looking at just one small segment of the spike protein. So we call it the receptor binding domain. It's where the protein will actually bind to your cell in order to enter the cell. Because you're looking at the whole spike protein, well, rather thousands of little sections of the spike protein, if you've had that little mutation in the receptor binding domain, an antibody might not bind that anymore, but your T cell responses will still recognize those other portions of that protein. So you should still get that protection from severe disease. And that's kind of what we see with influenza. So we end up with our seasonal changes of influenza, so that day over day change reduces our antibody binding, but we still have relatively good stability from severe disease. When you get a major shift in influenza, like in 1918, or even in 2009 with the swine flu epidemic, but the 2009, it happened to be that there was a similar epidemic in 1958 or 60, somewhere around there. So the most vulnerable people had those T cell responses and weren't susceptible to severe disease, but it exploded in the population. It spread like wildfire, but was a lot less severe. So we'd expect to see something similar, like influenza changes at the drop of a hat. Influenza is also a segmented genome. So instead of being one long piece of RNA, influenza has 8 little chunks. And when you're building an influenza virus, it doesn't necessarily need all 8 chunks from the same parent virus. So if you take one cell and you put a pig flu gene or pig flu virus, a human flu virus, and a bird flu virus into it, and it's building a new virus, it could say, all right, I'm going to take segments 1, 3, and 5 from human, 2 and 4 from pig, and the rest from bird. We'll throw it together, we'll stick it out, we'll see what happ's. A lot of times they don't do anything, they're just non-infectious, but sometimes they become super viruses. And that's how we got 1918's pandemic.
Okay, now I recognize, we got to get out of here in a minute. Couple of very quick questions. There are 3 vaccines that have soaked up a lot of the attention. There are more than that in development. Can you comment on some of the others and where you see potential?
Yeah, so there's a few other adenovirus vectored vaccines. They're still fairly early into their clinical trials. There's a number of vaccine candidates that were traditional dead virus with adjuvants and similar to an influenza vaccine. I think Australia had one, or Australia or New Zealand had one. A friend of mine was working on it. That one just got canceled because it just wasn't, what they're finding, they really need the T cell responses. So the adenovirus vectored vaccines, those are probably going to be as effective, but a big chunk of it is because these top 3 companies had such a similar vaccine already in clinical trials, it was a lot easier for them to pivot their technology and re-engineer it. These other companies are kind of starting from the ground up and have to design the processes to build and engineer everything before they even had the chance to start into testing things.
Okay, and then second last question. Any concerns about the production cycle? We're producing vast volumes of, or vast amounts of vaccine in seemingly very short order. Any reason for concern or pause there?
Not that I can really think of. I mean, if you think about it, we produce global supplies of influenza vaccine in a very similar time frame, right? The technology to scale drug production, the companies all have the technology, they have the techniques, they have the resources. It's just a matter of figuring out how to do it and then putting it into the bioreactors.
Okay, and then the final 2-part question. Will you be getting your shot?
Absolutely. I am very hopeful that as a healthcare worker, I'm hoping for a shot soon.
Fair enough. And then, while the rest of us, us mere mortals, wait for our shot, what advice do you have for us to follow?
You know what? As and I'll be doing much of the same things as I'm waiting. It's going to be a long winter. Keep the masking works, the social distancing works, the hand hygiene works. I'll end off with kind of a quick thing. I get this a lot, especially from like anti-mask people. If masking works, why social distance? If social distancing works, why wear a mask? And I always respond back to it with, if my brakes work, why do I need a seatbelt? And if my seatbelt works, why do I need airbags? None of these techniques are perfect. None of them are 100% effective. But safety measures aren't designed to be one thing to be 100% effective. It's designed to say, we take this that's shown to have some benefits, this that's shown to have some benefits, and we add them together. And in infectious disease, we call it something that we call it the Swiss cheese model. So every layer has some holes, but if you line them all up, the hope is that not all the holes line up, so that something getting through will eventually get caught by one of the layers, right? Keep on keep on the practices. It's actually in effect stopped influenza transmission, which is remarkable because we are testing 3 times more nationally than we normally do for influenza. So it's not just we're calling everything COVID, we're actually testing a lot for influenza, and we're just not seeing the transmission. So they work, they absolutely work. And the unfortunate reality is, if we lift these precautions, we will see COVID spread far, far, far faster.
Well, thank you. This has been extremely informative, educational. I want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us. A few people still have questions that we just simply didn't get to. I'm going to pass those along to you, and we can
absolutely
see if we can get those answered. Thanks, Kevin. Much appreciated, and wishing you a safe and happy holiday.
Thank you, yourself as well. And it'll be a rough one this year, but we'll get through it together.
Fair enough.
All right. You can do.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.